Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time you're watching or listening to this, and welcome to this week's episode of the Non-Identity Podcast. Now, this week we're joined by someone who likes to help people strategize with their podcast. It's Aeoliana. Hi, Aeoliana. Welcome to the show.
Hey, how are you?
Thank you so much for joining us. Before we get into podcast strategy, can you just explain to people who you are, where you grew up and stuff?
Sure. So I'm Aeoliana. I'm from Puerto Rico originally, but I have called the Tampa, Florida area my home for almost 30 years. Oh my God, I can't believe I'm saying that. It's been forever. So I was a paralegal for 20 plus years. I'm married. I have an 11-year-old son who is a hockey player. So our life is all about hockey. I love musicals. I love all things Marvel. I love true crime. And I am a podcast launch strategist. And what I do is I help people get through all the overwhelm in launching a podcast, answer their questions, and make it a little bit easier for them to maneuver by using a lot of mindset, focusing on the balance, the communication, the authenticity, like I said, mastering their mindset and empowering them to get their voices out there because we all have a message to share.
No, 100%. Before we get into all that, just like growing up and stuff, how was childhood and what careers did you go into before you became a podcast strategist?
Oh my gosh. Okay. So like I said, I was born in Puerto Rico. I grew up there till about 9, 10 years old. My dad's company transferred him from there to Florida. Went to school, went to college. I'm the only one in my family, well, out of my siblings to go to college. Got my
Well done.
criminology degree. I've worked at Walgreens, which is a local drugstore here in the States, Publix, which is a local grocery store. Um, I've worked in clothing stores. I worked as a probation officer for 3 years. I've worked in every law firm known to man, in every type of law known to man. I worked for the state attorney's office in here in Florida for several years, and I worked anywhere from juvenile cases all the way to felony drug cases in the years that I was there. And yeah, I mean, I've done pretty much all of the things, except I was never a server. I've never worked in a restaurant because I know my limits and I'd be the one spitting in people's food. And I've never worked in the school system just because, again, I can teach my son, but I don't have the patience to teach other people's children. So I've never worked in those two places.
It's really mad that you say that because obviously, as our listeners will know, that I work in the education system. I'm very patient at work. I'm not at home. I'm complete opposite at home, which is really strange. When it comes to my own children, they can test my patience, but I'm okay with other people's children.
Yeah, no, I'm good with mine. Other people's children, I'm like, no, you should know better. Like, especially if I know their parents, I'm like, I know your parents. You should know better.
Going back to childhood, because obviously, like you said, you came over when you was 9 or 10. What cultural difference did you notice, and was it a shock to the system?
The only thing that was a little bit of a shock was TV shows for the most part, because I would watch, and I still do it today. Like I would watch cartoons and shows in Puerto Rico, and obviously they were in Spanish. And so the voice actors were different. And then I would watch them here and the voices were different. Like I remember, for instance, Thundercats was one of the shows I watched growing up. And I watched the episodes when they put them on YouTube, and the voices were different than what I remember. And I remember telling my husband, going, their voices aren't right. Like they don't sound right. That's not right. And so, because over there in Puerto Rico, it's basically the same as here in the States. It's, because we're a part of the United States, so everything's pretty much the same. Education, stuff like that is a little bit different. But for the most part, it's basically the same. So it wasn't that much of a culture shock for me, just I think the language, but in Puerto Rico that it's required for you to learn English. So I had basic knowledge of the language. It was just, jumping into the different education system here versus what we were having over there.
And I really, and then, like you said, when you went off to college and stuff, you studied criminology. Why did you
I
choose
did.
that field?
I love true crime. I've always loved true crime. I love the criminal mind, like those thoughts, things like that. And there was just a field that interested me. Like initially I thought I wanted to be an attorney, and then I realized that I'm either going to have to defend someone who is innocent or who's guilty, or I'm going to have to prosecute someone who's innocent. And I was like, I don't want that. That's a heavy load, you know? So I just decided, I'm like, I'll just do the background work. It's all good. I'll just do the background work.
You might be able to actually answer a question. I was talking with my wife the other night. If a defendant lawyer knows that someone's guilty, how
Mm-hmm.
do they go about defending them? Do they have to declare or?
So what I've noticed is that in every situation, like even if you know that they're guilty, you can mitigate it in a way. Like you
Yeah,
can kind of say, well, yeah, they did it, but they did it for this reason. So sometimes you're not, what I've seen from the attorneys I've worked with, you're not necessarily defending them for doing whatever it is that they're accused of. You're defending them in a way saying, well, it could have been this, or it could have been because of this, or it could have been because of something else, something else could have caused it, or someone else could have done it, or and then sometimes it's just the police and things like that. There's things get dropped, things get lost, and that happens because we're all human and we all make mistakes. Police and investigators and everything they're wonderful people, but they're human just like everyone else. So sometimes attorneys will like to take the route of this mistake was made, so this shouldn't happen, kind of thing, is what I've seen in my experience.
yeah. Because like I said, we were just discussing, and I sort of said the same thing. They will try and find the reason behind, not
Mm-hmm.
the actual thing. And she said it must be very hard as a burden for that person. But I then said, but everyone has got the right to be defended. It's the
100%.
criminal
Yeah. Yeah.
justice system, so therefore
Yeah.
someone's got to do that job. And when it comes to true crime, what cases have fascinated you the most? What have you really got into?
I am fascinated by serial killer cases. So
So obviously
like
Ted Bundy.
the yeah, so like those things like Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, things like that. Just to think, because of how I was raised and the people that I know, to know that there's people out there that have that evil in them is just like a foreign concept to me.
Yeah,
And I'm like, I want to know, what is it in their upbringing that, was it something in their upbringing? Like, was it something that happened to them? Or was it just, it's the whole nurture versus nature argument. Like, were they born that way? Or was something in their past, did something in their past happen to make them be the way they are? Not
no,
excusing
exactly.
what they're doing, just, I just want to understand.
And I think what I find fascinating, because I do like a lot of true crime as well, is the genius is the wrong word, but the smartness of a serial killer to be able, like Ted Bundy was very charming, and he
Yeah.
kept that hidden well for years. And I know obviously technology's improved, and maybe
Mm-hmm.
some of the techniques he used back then wouldn't pass it nowadays. But it's just amazes me how someone who can come across so charming,
Right.
charismatic, could
Yeah.
commit those horrific crimes that he did.
Yeah. Yeah. And it was his charm and his charisma that allowed him to do it for so long, because he was literally a guy that you would never think would do that, because he was good looking, he was well educated, he spoke well, he was very formal. And so you don't equate those two things with, someone with an evil mind like that. It does, in our minds, it doesn't compute. You're like, if someone comes from a good background and they're articulate and they're educated, they couldn't possibly do that. It's like the same thing with like BTK. It was the same way. He was like super educated, had a great job, had a stable family, had kids, and there was this whole other side of him that was crazy.
Do you think that it's in human nature to have them tendencies, and obviously the difference is if people choose to act on it or not? Do you think we've all got that deep down rooted in us?
I think we all have some semblance of that, but I think where those types of people differ is they have no self-control and they have no empathy. Like one of the what's the word? Like one of the indicators is a lack of empathy from a young age.
Yeah.
And so where you and I can look at something and be like, yeah, we're really mad. Yeah, we're really upset. Like for instance, this morning, somebody cut me off and flicked me off, and my son was in the car with me. And to a normal person, yeah, you get mad, yeah, you get upset and you yell and whatever, but it doesn't affect me in the way that someone without empathy and someone who just is out for anger and that's their only source of emotion, that person's probably going to hunt them down and find them. And like it's different. Like for me, it's like, yeah, you're a jerk, you suck, but my day isn't ruined because you are in a rush and whatever. So I think that's the difference, is the majority of us have that voice in our head that tells us that's not right, you shouldn't do that, and we have empathy for other human beings. And so I think all of us have a little bit of that in us, but we know that that's not the right way of thinking and the right way of doing things, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And do you think with those type of people, a lot of empathy is lost because of traumatic experiences they've had? So then they lose that empathy, and then other human life doesn't matter because, like you said, they've lost that empathy.
Right. Probably because they felt like they didn't matter. So they're like, well, if I didn't matter, then, why should I care? No one cared about me. So why should I care about anybody else?
It goes back to the saying I've heard a lot this week: hurt people.
Right. Yes. Yes.
And it's really weird because that saying, I don't know why, I keep hearing it all week this week for some reason, all over social media, other people I speak to, I was always saying hurt people.
Yeah.
So,
and that's true. I mean, that's true. Like when you're talking and you come from a place where you're hurt about things, in your childhood, in your adulthood, in your teenager, wherever the hurt happened, and you haven't dealt with it, every time you come into those situations where maybe what you're talking about or who you're talking to reminds you of something that happened, you're going to react and you're going to answer from that place of hurt because you haven't moved past it. And it's not anything that you're doing intentionally. Like you don't mean to hurt this person, but you don't know any other way. Like you haven't dealt with your hurt and your trauma and your stuff. So you're just projecting what you're feeling onto someone else. And it's totally instinctual. It's a survival. It's not, like I said, you're not trying to hurt anyone. That's just how you're reacting. And like you said, when we're hurt, we hurt others. And then in turn, they hurt others. And it's just this constant cycle until we can all sit down and be like, no, I'm going to deal with this. I'm going to deal with the uncomfortable, with the difficult. And then I can move on from a place of I'm understanding so I can understand you kind of thing.
No, 100%. Right, so we'll move on to podcast strategy. Sorry, I know we took a sidebar there.
No,
why did you decide to look into podcasting and podcast strategizing?
Yeah. So I started listening to podcasts in 2015, again, true crime, stuff like that. In 2019, I got sick. I was in the hospital and the law firm I was working for let me go while I was in the hospital. So nice, yeah, I know, right? It's fabulous. Florida has no unions, so there was nothing I could do. Here, if you have under 50 employees, you can let go people whenever you want. There's no like time or anything like that. So I got a really quick job. I was working in a construction company. I recently just lost that job 2 weeks ago too. So it's been a whole thing. So I decided, I was like, well, I can do some stuff from home. My husband was working from home. I was still going to the office even during COVID. And so I started learning how to do VA work, virtual assistant work, listening to podcasts. Then I got into how to edit and publish and produce a podcast by listening to podcasts. Very meta, I know. And then I was talking to some people, I was helping some people out. I did that, on the side for a year or so. And in end of 2022, beginning of 2023, I started talking more to people about the strategy and the foundations and stuff like that. And I had a client of mine that was like, you do really well with the producing and the editing, but you're so much better in walking people through how to get the right foundation, how to get it started properly, how to relaunch it if you're kind of stuck, and things like that. And so I was like, I kind of pivoted it to that in 2023. And then this year, I've kind of not pivoted out of that, but more creating my framework of how I help people do it. So I call it became, so BCAME, and it's balance, communication, authenticity, mindset, and empowerment. And so I try to use all of those when I'm helping my clients figure out their name, figure out, what they're going to talk about, their format, how they're going to publish, how they're going to get listeners, things like that. Because when we're doing podcasting, you don't really think about, when you're listening to a podcast, I know I did this, you don't think about how much work goes behind the scenes of it. You just think that you hit record and it's out there for everyone to hear. And there's so many steps in the background. And so when someone starts their podcast and they start like Googling and looking up what to do to have a podcast, it's like people are talking about how much money you need to spend, how much time is invested, all the things that you have to do. And so I try really hard, like that's why balance is my first one, is I try really hard to help people balance their life with their podcast. Like it's not another job. It's part of who you are, especially if you have something you need to say. It's part of who you are. So you just bring it into the fold with everything else you're doing and make time for it, just like everything else. Like just now, as we were talking, my son popped in to give me a note that he wanted to know how to heat up the pizza because apparently he's hungry. So things like that happen. And so, he knew I was on. So he wrote me a little note and I responded in a little note and he left and he's like, thank you, and went to go make his pizza. So it's like things like that. We balance who we are, what we're trying to say, what we're trying to do with the rest of our lives.
And I can 100% resonate. As we were speaking, my daughter's walked in to get a drink.
Yeah.
Because I'm recording
saw her.
in the kitchen. Yeah, and you did see her.
I did. I saw her. It was all good. Like my son was like doing, marine stuff. Yeah. Like he was on the ground, like he was dragging, making sure that nobody saw him. And I'm like, it's okay, really.
See, this is where I'm lucky because I have it guest focus, so I don't come on screen during our interviews, so it don't really matter for me if people are in and
exactly.
out. Because when I was first doing it, I had to tell everyone to shut up, no one could come in the room, and I thought it's not fair on the rest of the household. Yep. So I thought, well, if I take myself away from the screen during the interviews, it then doesn't matter. So it's very guest focused. You just hear my voice, and then it don't matter if people are in and out then, and that was a way of getting the balance.
Yeah. And it's another thing I tell my clients too, is that if you're going to do something like that, include your family in it. So if you're going to schedule out your time, like I've had a lot of people that are like, okay, I have to schedule my podcast first and then my family time. No. You schedule your family time first and then your podcast schedule goes around that. So if you sit down as a family and you tell your family, hey, on these days I'm recording. So when I'm in the room and the door's closed, I'm recording. Don't interrupt me for an hour or however long you need to record. Then everybody's on the same page. I mean, with me, it's a little bit different because like I told my husband, I'm going upstairs. I have a podcast at 5. And my son comes in a little bit later. He goes, Daddy didn't know where you were. And I'm like, I literally just told him I was going upstairs to record a podcast. But he gets in his job and he focuses, and the world can fall apart and he has no idea until he's done. And he's like, oh wait, what happened? So you could even try that and it still doesn't work, but it's fine. It's fine.
What is your biggest advice for someone starting a podcast? Because I've read some statistic, and I can probably see why it does happen, that only 10% of people carry on after the first 6 months. And obviously, as I said, I've been going 2 years, and there's been points where I've just thought to myself, why? Yeah. So I can see why it happens. So what advice do you give to people for starting and being able to consistently carry on?
So my biggest advice, and the thing that I've seen the most with people who end up relaunching, is they started a podcast without a clear definition of what success was for them or a clear goal of what they wanted. A lot of us listen to podcasts and we think that we're going to end up the same way as the big name podcasts with like millions and millions of downloads and things like that. What we're not looking at, what people don't look at, is that 9 times out of 10, those podcasts have been around for a really long time. They have money behind them and they have teams of people behind them. So when we're doing solo work, we are the ones that are recording. We're the ones creating the content. We're the ones promoting, publishing, marketing, all of those things. And as a single person, those are a lot of hats to wear when you don't know what you're doing. Versus when you have a team, you can just hit record and literally send it to someone else and get it done, which eventually everybody can if that's what you want to do. But at the beginning, I try to tell my clients, I try to start from a point of, okay, we need to figure out what is your why, because that's the one thing that's gonna propel you through the hard times. Understanding why you're doing what you're doing. What is the message you're trying to share? And it can't be, I want to make money, because you're not going to make money right away. You're not going to make money right away. You're not. So it has to be something bigger, and it has to be something bigger than you. And the majority of the time, it's just a lot of people have something to say. That's why when COVID happened, so many people were on podcasts, because we were isolated. We needed community. We needed that unity. We needed other people. And podcasting helped with that, because you were able to sit down and share your thoughts, share your feelings, share what was going on in your life. And whether you knew it or not, people were listening. And it's a great platform to learn, to grow. Like, I do a lot of my mindset work through podcasting. I've learned so much about myself, my relationships, my family, even like trauma that I had. It's helped me to figure out, okay, therapy, things like that, that I never would have gone to had I not listened to a podcast. I've met people that I never would have met otherwise. And it's been such an eye-opening thing. It's really, podcasting, I think, has made the world a lot smaller than we ever thought it was, because you're able to connect in so many ways with so many people in so many different forms. So yeah, my thing would be, just go ahead and do it. Stop thinking about it, and have what success is for you for your podcast. That is so important. Don't compare yourself to the podcasts that have been out there for 5, 6, 7 years. Realize that you're simple. You're just one person. So maybe for you, success looks like you wanted to do an episode a week, and you did it for a whole month or a whole 2 months or a whole 3 months. Celebrate that. Be excited about that. That's success for you. Now, maybe in 6 months, that success is going to be different. Just, you're going to retailer it to look at it, have it look a little differently, but always knowing what's your focus, what's your why, and what's your definition of success.
No, I totally resonate with that, because my biggest thing was hitting the go button. This was in my mind for 6 months, and I kept having what if no one wants to be a guest? What if no one listens? And then I've just told myself, no, I've got to do it. And I've recorded through my phone. I edit on my phone. Everything's produced through my phone, because I haven't got the money to have all that equipment at the moment. That's the goal for the future. But if I waited to start with that, I don't think I ever would have started. And what you're saying about success, like, we're in a world now of social media where everything's about numbers. But if you then break it down, like, I'm blown away with my TikTok following. I have nearly 55,000 followers on TikTok.
Oh, wow. I gotta
Each video,
find you. I'm on TikTok too. I'll find you.
Brilliant. Each video does between 300 and 500 views. And I sit there and think, imagine speaking to 300 or 500 people in one go.
Right.
In
Yes.
a room. Because people would say that's a small number. To me, that's not. That's a big number. I've got the 800 subscribers on YouTube. Again, have 800 people in a room. Speak to them. Feel out. But you're putting that out there to people. And I don't understand Spotify too well. But I'd say I get about 1,500 impressions a month. And to me, that means 1,500 people have seen my name.
Yeah.
So again, that just blows me away with amazement that people took the time to even look at my content. So to me, that's how I measure my success. And like I said, it's so easy to get bogged down with numbers because they're not real. Yeah. And as in, like, you see 300, you think that's a small number. But again, like I said, have that many people in front of you. And I think that's what people have got to remember when they're podcasting. And also, I think I'm about 48 interviews in, and I've took a lesson off of each person I've interviewed. Yeah. And like you said, with the connecting with people, I've never been able to have that opportunity. So I think that's such a great thing. The only thing that does bog me down is the editing. I'm not a lover of editing.
You know, are you a Mac user or are you
a Windows InShot?
Okay,
just through my phone on InShot.
I know that there's 2 platforms that you can edit for free. And if it's a Mac, it's GarageBand. And if it's Windows, it's Audacity. So I do all mine, and I haven't even released my podcast yet. I'm just recording it and setting it up, and I'll release it later. But I do all my recording and all my editing in Audacity. And then I don't really edit. I mean, I'll edit the extra pauses and things like that, like the dead air, but I don't really edit my ums and my likes because that's how I talk.
Exactly.
And, you know, so I really don't go crazy with the editing, because that's another thing too, is when you're doing a podcast, maybe, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago, people wanted it polished and perfect. Now people just want to hear you. You know, you want to talk in a way that if you were to run into one of your listeners, they would be able to recognize that it's you by your voice. And if you over edit and you over make everything perfect, it's not going to sound like you. It's not going to be like you. I say like a lot. I say a lot. So I want to keep those in there as best as I can, because that's who I am. That's a true representation of me. But I do know that a lot of people don't like that and they want to clean it up. And so that editing takes a little bit longer, but I guess it's personal preference. But that's great that your mindset is, you know, that's how many people, if I was in a room, that would be how many people would be listening to me. That's great. Because it reminds you that, you know, even though to some people it might be a small number, you know, like I've never spoken in front of, you know, 300, 200 people, 20 people. I've never done that. So to have that many people listening, that's a big deal. That's amazing.
No, thank you. See, what I find, because mine is primarily video based, so I edit the video for YouTube and then I'll convert the file to MP3, and that's what goes up to Spotify. I at first was very editing out the ums, but like you said, that is part of you. The only thing I tend to edit down is me talking sometimes, because I sometimes feel like I try to explain my question a bit too long-winded. So I do edit that down a little bit, but I try and keep the guest answers as authentic and as real as possible, because it's their episode. But one thing I do find, and I don't know if you've had clients that feel the same, because I'm handling people's stories, I feel like there's a responsibility to make sure I get the point across of what the guest wants across, because it's their story. Do you know what I mean? It's quite a big responsibility sometimes, especially if I'm speaking to an abuse survivor.
Yeah.
And they're getting their story out there. I need to, it's a big responsibility sometimes. Do you think people can crumble with that responsibility sometimes?
You know, that's a really interesting thing you said, because I think sometimes, and I was talking to my husband about this similar thing earlier today. And I think when you have the awareness that you're trying to share the story as authentic as you can, share the story as true to form as you can, that to me says a lot. Because you could totally look at it and be like, well, this story doesn't fit the way I edit, or doesn't fit the way I do this or I do that. So let me cut it so that it does fit. But you're realizing, like, no, this story needs to be heard in the way it was told. I don't need to change anything. I don't need to, I need to keep it as true to the story of the person as I can, and work around it. And so I think you can get bogged down with that easily. But if you have that awareness, and the sun is driving me mad.
We've got we've got a wind and a storm here tonight, so you're
I'm
quite.
like, I closed my window thinking that it wasn't going to hit me, but I have a maple tree right outside my window, and the sun keeps hitting the leaves, and it's like coming through this one spot in my window. So I apologize if I look like I'm a sci-fi character here in the video. I apologize. I'm trying to move. I'm trying to move so it doesn't do it. But yeah, so you can totally get bogged down with that. But I think if you have the awareness from the beginning that you're going to share the story as real and as authentic as you can, I think that gets rid of some of that overwhelm and some of that fear, because then you're really not having to do anything. You're just sharing what your guest is saying in its natural form.
No, yeah, I totally resonate with that. Just like I said, though, sometimes, because when you're editing, in a way, it's perception. We all have different perceptions of things. If we was all asked to explain what something looked like, we'd all give a different perception. And I
Right.
feel
Yeah.
a lot of the time when you're editing to your perception. And
Right.
like you said, when you're interviewing other people and they're sharing their stories, you've got to try and keep it authentic to them.
Mm-hmm.
One thing I do struggle a lot with, and I know probably many podcasters do, is marketing. What advice would you give for marketing a podcast?
So I would say share it everywhere and anywhere you can. So if you're putting out a podcast episode and you have email subscribers, talk about it in an email. Use it as content for your socials. When I start clients out, I like to have them create a launch squad, and that's what I call people who are already fans of theirs. So it could be like your mom, your sister, your wife, people that are going to support you, and get started with them and have them be the ones that listen and put the reviews in. Always ask for reviews at the end of your podcast. You know, the reviews don't hurt, and it helps you know what you're doing right and what people are resonating with. And let me see, what else would I say? Yeah, just put it all on socials and share it as much as you can, and just think about doing it. If it ever gets tough, think about doing it more for what you want to give others. So how are you wanting to serve others? What is it that you're wanting to share that maybe someone else didn't say, that you needed to hear when you were having a tough time, or when you were going through something, or when you needed a little bit of inspiration or a little bit of a push? What was something that you would have liked to have heard? What was the type of support that you would have liked to have had that you didn't have? And be that for someone else. Because I'm a big believer, if you have something in your heart to say, it's because someone out there is waiting to hear it from you. Whatever that is, someone out there is and you can say, oh, well, someone else already said it and they said it better than I did. Well, I mean, everything we hear on a daily basis, someone else has said it at some point. None of us are coming up with just brand new ideas. Everything stems from another idea. And so, but they haven't heard it from you. So you need to be the one to say whatever it is they need to hear.
No, 100%. And if people want your help and support, where can they find you?
So the easiest place to find me is my website. So it's www.topshelfvirtualservices.com. So that's top, T-O-P, shelf, SHELF, virtual services. And Top Shelf, my son came up with that name because that's the top of the net. That's where he shoots. So hockey term.
Always back to the hockey. And we'll make sure
Always.
we'll make sure we put the links in the description below so people can get to you quicker. We're just coming up to the end. It's been a fascinating conversation, but I've got one last question, and this question I ask all my guests. If you could be remembered for one word and one word only, what would it be and why?
Service. I have, regardless of where I've worked and what I've done, my main focus has always been to serve and to help people in any way I can. And so I want to be remembered for being someone who was willing to serve without benefit to myself. And yeah, that's a lot from my parents. I learned that from my parents. And I just that's in my heart. That would be how I want to be remembered.
Well, brilliant. Thank you so much for your time. It's been a real pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you. Likewise.
You're more than welcome to come back on anytime you want.
No, thanks.